It was Sigmund Freud who made the term death instinct popular, although some female psychoanalyst, I think, invented the term before him. I think he actually had a relationship with her, but anyway, it was Freud who coined the term death instinct. In fact, properly it should be death drive, but we'll use the term death instinct for the purpose of this particular podcast. The death instinct is opposed to Eros, the sex drive. So we have the death instinct, which is essentially destruction, and the sex drive, or Eros, which is essentially creation. You'd expect that in a universe that is essentially zero, that those two things would oppose each other and probably amount to zero. The interesting thing about all of this is that it maps onto the idea of entropy. Now, I'm not going to dwell ever so long on the idea of entropy because the terms in entropy are confusing. So, for example, in entropy, when we say that there is a disordered system, in everyday language we would probably say it's ordered. So I'm going to use the everyday terms. So an example would be, if you have a room full of people who are identically dressed, have exactly the same opinions, the same education, the same social background, so on and so forth, that in terms of entropy would be disordered. But of course, when we look at it, we see all these people, each a clone of the other. We think, oh, that's very orderly. So I'll use the everyday terms, because if I get into entropy, then basically it's going to confuse things. But the important thing to realize is that the situation with low entropy that we would look at and consider to be chaotic is actually a very creative environment. And you can sort of map this onto the essential thing, which for creativity is the sex drive. The act of sex, the whole energy around sex is fairly chaotic. And then you go to the other extreme, which is in everyday language, a very orderly state of affairs. And in that state of affairs, then we have high entropy. High entropy is death, and in fact physicists say about the universe that it will die an entropic death, where all of the matter is pretty much the same, has the same levels of energy. There are no differentiations. When there are no differentiators, then there can be no energy exchange. When there's no energy exchange, there can be no creation. So the universe will end its days sort of like a soup of matter, all of it pretty much in the same energy state. So nothing can happen. Things can only happen when you have disorder, when things are in different energy states. Now this in turn sort of maps onto how we view life. The life instinct, or Eros, is, as Schopenhauer called it, the will to life. It's the dominant thing. It keeps us alive. If none of us had this will to life, we probably wouldn't bother to eat. We might just think, oh, this is more trouble than it's worth, and we might just say, oh, well, I'm just going to lay down and die. But we don't, because we have this will to life, this sex drive, this creative drive within us. And the creative drive wants to create more stuff. So, if you want a good example of a creative environment, just go to any city. It's actually buzzing with energy and people. Many of them doing very different things, different professions. It's a chaotic sort of environment. And then you look at the other side, which is an environment that is essentially driven by the death instinct. And I'm going to shock you here, or maybe not, but shocked me when I thought about it. When you look at very orderly environments, what do you think of? Well, there are some very good examples. A monastery. A monastery is full of people who essentially do pretty much the same thing day in, day out. They are driven very, very rigidly by a timetable. Everything is very, very orderly. They all dress the same. There are really no differentiators between the people in a monastery. Yeah, except for experience and seniority, but beyond that, nothing very much. They all believe the same thing, they read the same things, they talk about the same things. This, from an entropic point of view, is death. And this raises a really interesting point. While we think that religions, well, maybe you don't, but traditionally people think that religions are concerned with life, but actually they're not. They're concerned with death, they're concerned with order. So a monastic order, a Buddhist temple. The Buddhists do the same thing pretty much every day, sweep the yard, do the dishes, whatever. They all dress the same, they all chant the same. It's a kind of denial of life. And this is something that Schopenhauer talked about in his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation. In fact, right near the end of that work is a chapter called The Denial of the Will to Life, or something like that. And he talks about this opposition to the creative force, to the will to life. Because in his view, we look at it and we see how it creates and what it creates, and how it creates billions of individual creatures, all typically striving against each other in some way, and creating, rather a large amount of suffering. And so this denial of the will to life is basically a move towards order. And people wouldn't normally think of it like that. The will to life itself is chaotic. The universe is fairly chaotic. In 2 billion years' time, the Andromeda galaxy will collide with the Milky Way. Who knows what's going to come out of that? And for millions of years, possibly, maybe billions, I don't know, there will be chaos on a grand scale, and something new will be born out of it. So, if you want to pursue the life instinct, then you need to embrace chaos. And it's an interesting thing that entrepreneurs in business are typically, fairly chaotic sort of characters. I created a business, and I'm a fairly chaotic character, although this kind of analysis may cause me to change some of my behaviors, because this analysis is fairly new for me. But I'm a fairly chaotic sort of character, and I created a business. It was successful, yada yada yada. And then when it got to a certain size, the administrators came in. They wanted order, everything on spreadsheets, and the business started to die, which is typically the way things happen. And it's actually quite amusing that venture capital companies, they say that they invest in, say, 10 companies, and only one of them will be successful. Well, I've got news for them. The reason that happens is because they actually kill them by too much order. If you have a relatively young company and you want it to grow, it has to be slightly chaotic. You cannot tie it up with spreadsheets and process. And so we see this happening in life. When people are young, they tend to be fairly chaotic. young people can be fairly wild, and then as they get older, they calm down. They adopt habit. Maybe they do the same thing every day, the same breakfast. Maybe they take the dog for a walk at the same time. All of these kind of things, and this is a sign of death. Now, the terms creation and death have their own sort of flavour. Everybody wants to think in terms of creation because at the root of us is this very powerful will to life. So yeah, we want to think in terms of life. But actually, if you want to deny life, then all you have to do is become very, very ordered. Do the same thing every day. And to someone who's young, that will sound like death. And indeed, that is exactly what it is. But is that necessarily a bad thing? It's just a decision you have to make. For some people, the thrill of creativity, of Eros, of sex, of chaos, is addictive. And maybe it will always be addictive for them. The price they pay, of course, is that life doesn't operate purely for them, and so they will experience disappointment, pain, all the things that go with ambitions that are not realized, and activity that proves to be fruitless. Or a person can say, I'm not all that interested in all this creativity stuff. It's a pile of crap. I'd rather just live a little bit like a Buddhist monk or a Christian monk or something. A very orderly life. And of course, whichever route you take, there will be a temptation to indulge in the opposite. But there's the choice. Choose life, as it said in Train Spotting, and you choose chaos and creativity and potentially a lot of pain and angst. And you can choose death, where in essentially you are denying the will to life. You are denying this creative capability. And you are choosing death through a very orderly, same thing, every day, day in, day out, kind of life. Now, finally, I'll just end on one particular note, and that is, because people do not choose these things consciously typically, they can end up suffering a great deal. So let's consider a man and a woman, or two people of the same sex, whatever, being partners for a long time. During that relationship, they have censored each other to a fair extent. They've reached compromises on what they can think and talk about and so on. And so they become pretty much the same. Being the same means that we are talking about death. And so they're in a relationship where they are the same, and there is no excitement. And because there's no excitement, they become unhappy. If they want excitement. So they've made no conscious, they haven't thought about this consciously, they've just drifted into some situation that is a situation of death. And it's the same with businesses. Businesses that are too orderly will probably go broke. And this hasn't been a conscious decision, it's just because the way businesses go is that the administrators want certainty, and the only way you get certainty, well, you never get certainty really, but their pretend certainty that exists on spreadsheets is by organizing everything. But you can choose consciously between life and death. Personally, I'm more inclined towards the death bit of it. I've done a lot of the life stuff and found it fairly unrewarding. The death side of it I've found to be actually more interesting and more rewarding. So you have a choice. Choose life, chaos, sex, eros, creativity, and all the pains and pleasures that might go with that. Or you can choose death, which is orderly, a very regimented, organized life, and be rather more peaceful, because of course death is the ultimate peace. We assume anyway. Anyway, I thought I'd share those thoughts and hope they're useful.